if there's no active, intentional work on a relationship similar to how you would tend a garden, there'll be weeds. It'll look like a mess. Relationships without intentional action always lead to entropy. We are back.
We are with a blue drink.
Yeah, with your potion.
Yeah.
Your magic potion.
Yes,
Dale
it is.
decided to upgrade a little bit.
I did. So this is, it's not really magic potion, but it has a little bit of methyl blue in it.
Okay.
My little testing this out. It's a little
Yeah.
immune booster.
Yeah, if anyone knows Dale likes to test out things.
Yeah, it's in all truth, this does not have a lot in it, even though it looks like it. It's literally 2 drops. That's it. But
Yeah. So methyl blue, you said?
yeah, it is.
And then with...
I believe
Don't
it.
just... Yeah, because if that was all methyl blue...
Oh, no.
I don't think
No.
you'd be able to
I wouldn't
talk.
be standing here. But no, they're Clever Tonic. So it's basically,
Yeah.
or no, Clever Mocktails. That's what
Cover
they are.
mocktail. Yeah, I think I have a blueberry
Yeah, I've got a cherry or something. I don't
cherry.
know.
Okay.
Strawberry.
They're
something.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, they're good.
They're
I like
nice.
it. I like
All
it.
right. Cool. Well, Dale, I was thinking we could switch gears a little bit
Okay.
on some of the things we've been talking about here.
Okay.
And talk about love. Talk about marriage in particular.
Those two combine pretty well, I would say.
Yeah, well, hopefully, because, start off, we've kind of highlighted a bit about our backgrounds professionally,
Yeah.
but personally, we're both married.
Yeah.
5 years, and I think you hit 15.
Yeah. That's right.
15, that's a long time.
You know, I feel like it's a long time, but then I meet people that are like married for like 40 years, and I'm just like, wow,
Yeah.
that's like incredible to me. But
Does
yes,
it feel,
is.
though, like it's
You
a
know-
long time for you? Because
It honestly,
for me, I've been married 5, and it doesn't feel, I feel like
Yeah.
we just got married.
yeah, right. You know, I guess in one sense, because I have children now, it's like I feel like things fly by, and simultaneously they also go really slowly. So
Interesting. Yeah.
I guess case in point, no, it has gone really fast. The last 15 years have definitely gone fast, and the last 20 of being together have flown by.
Mm-hmm.
So
Because I think one of the fears that many people might voice or think about, and that's one of the things I felt when I was about to get married, is the fear of like, is this thing gonna feel old? Like, are you gonna feel like you're growing out of it? Like it's getting dull. Like it's getting, you know what I'm saying?
yeah,
And so that's why, for me, I mean, I don't know, maybe we can talk about different behaviors that make it feel like it's still new for Callie and I. Or is it that 5 years should feel this way, and 15 years feels more like, okay, it feels like we're kind of been doing this thing for a while, but now we gotta
you know,
do some extra things to make it feel not so old, not so like, hey, this thing is kind of getting old.
I think that's a great question. I think what makes that relevant, and this is kind of also predicated on, I think, what causes marriages to have success and what causes them to be more prone to failure. And I think that's how marriage is viewed. And I'm going to steal this a little bit, actually. So normally, I don't prepare for these at all. And I can't really say that I really prepared for this talk at all, but
Yeah.
I did have an inkling like 5 minutes before we were going to talk about marriage, and I was like, oh man, somebody said
Yeah.
something really relevant.
Yeah.
And so I have a couple of books here that I was like, man, these are really relevant to this conversation, I think, or at least with where it's going. But so coming back to that, I think what makes it feel old versus what makes it feel new is highly predicated on how we view it inherently, right? So I would suggest that if we view that we have a marriage, or rather we are in a marriage, I think it starts to feel older quicker. Just by the very notion of, oh, I have this thing, I can also lose this thing.
Mm.
And some of this may sound like semantics, but I think that you really have to think about it. If you view that you are married, that's something inherent to you as a being.
Mm-hmm.
I think intrinsically that has a much greater potential to have an identity to you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, versus saying, oh, well, I have this thing. Right? It's just this thing I have that I'm trying to work towards or work on, and sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's easy, right?
Yeah.
But I think, and full disclosure, I'm stealing this line of thinking from our good friend Viktor Frankl.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And
I was going to reference someone more recent.
Yeah, no.
James Clear.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he wrote Atomic Habits.
Okay, yeah. So what does he say?
So he talks about, like, if you want to keep up with a habit, it needs to become your identity. Like, I'm not like someone who runs on occasion. Like, I am a runner. And therefore I run. This is what I do. Versus, oh yeah, sometimes I run. Like, this is something I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
That the more you identify with the habit, the more you can keep up with it. Is that what Frankl kind of was hinting at, or from a different direction?
I would suggest that that's heavily intertwined. So that's great. Like, this is tying it already. It's perfect.
Maybe he got it from Frankl. I don't know.
Maybe I don't know. Well, so, but see, Frankl talks about the same thing, except in the notion of freedom, actually, which I think many people feel that they lose when they get married.
Right, because commitment feels at times like constraint.
Yes. But I think that to be married means also, it doesn't mean that you lose yourself. It just means that you bring yourself to this new environment, as it were. And so first, let me just describe what Frankl says about freedom, and we're going to tie it in to, this topic of marriage. So to give a little background, he's talking about what essentially made people have success in concentration camps, right? And this may sound really extreme, full disclosure, right? We're talking about marriage, and here I go like off on this tangent about concentration
let's talk
camps.
About concentration camps.
Right? Well, but I think
because marriage is a concentration
exactly.
camp.
Well, so I would say, to quote John Mayer, love is a battlefield, right? Well, not only John Mayer, right? But like, I think in many ways, it's really relevant to think about, does our culture support marriage as an identity, as a thing? Or does our culture, does our world, does our environment actually provide more barriers to having healthy marriages? And I would suggest that in most ways, it does more to distract and take away from marriage than it does to help it.
Yeah.
And for that reason, marriage is a battlefield. It's one that you have to become well accustomed to. And if you're not, you're going to get shot down. But now we're going to this realm of, here's where I'm going to tie in freedom and concentration camps, right?
Okay.
So Frankl talks about, again, we're talking about things that help people essentially have longevity in concentration camps. And Frankl is saying here, in fact, the weight of evidence tends to show that men who typified the character traits of the camp inmates who had succumbed to the character-forming forces of the social environment were those who had beforehand given up the struggle spiritually. The freedom to take what attitude they would toward the concrete situation had not been wrested from them. They had themselves withdrawn their claim to freedom. For whatever may have been taken from them in their first hour in camp until his last breath, no one can wrest from a man his freedom to take one or another attitude towards his destiny.
Break that down.
So
Yeah.
the reason why, and again, this may sound like an offshoot, but I think it's actually very relevant, because here he notes, again, he said they themselves had withdrawn their claim to use that freedom. And he has a little mark here, an excerpt that suggests freedom is not something we have. It is something we are. Marriage is not something you have. It is something you are.
Yeah.
Right? And I would suggest, in order to have true longevity in that way, that's what must be necessary to understand. Right? And when there isn't longevity in those places, that is what is taken away, or rather withdrawn from.
Yeah.
We hear, oh, I just don't feel like your spouse anymore.
Right.
I just don't feel, or I just can't do this. Now, let me be first very clear to say, look, I'm not talking about situations where there's abuse in a marriage, there's infidelity in a marriage, there's, again, constant turmoil of an extreme manner, right? I'm not talking about those scenarios. I'm talking about the day-to-day, everyday scenario that turns into the mundane and miasmic experiences that we cannot stand.
Right.
Or don't know how to stand.
The annoyances, the growing distance, maybe living life on autopilot. You're dealing with kids, dealing with responsibility. Maybe you want to talk about each other's day, and somehow when you try, it doesn't feel like it's translating, and you're not feeling heard. Maybe a lack of friendship. Conflict resolution is tough. Lack of intimacy. Just kind of those types of issues, right? Which is very common in marriages, right?
I would agree.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I would say that if we want to last in that environment, we have to be able to understand that marriage isn't something that we have. It's something that we are. Right? Identifying in that way, taking that on, not withdrawing that, provides longevity.
So I am married.
I am.
And so because I am
but
married,
understanding, really, like, you got to let that sink in.
Yeah, because I think one of the challenges with letting that sink in. So first of all, they're like, what does that practically mean? And then second of all, it's like, in order for me to be married, it requires another individual. And that's where people are like, I don't want to stake this identity so much on, like, it's like, yeah, but because most of the time when I see couples, everyone thinks,
Sorry, to interrupt you, but you've seen couples for a long time now.
Yeah, for a number of years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like what got me interested in becoming a therapist even before. So it's like I used to work with couples even prior to officially seeing them for counseling, right?
And if you don't mind, like, tell us a little bit about, like, your work with couples wasn't just like, it wasn't like just couples counseling.
Yeah.
Well,
no. Yeah. Well. So it was couples counseling. It was coaching, right?
Okay.
And then of course, just like the podcast that my wife and I had was bringing on different professionals in the field of mental health and others to discuss a lot of issues dealing with marriage, from like pre-marriage up till to divorce, right? So, yes. So with that said, especially married couples, whenever married couples come and see me, it's very expected that they believe they're not the problem and the other person is the problem, right? Yeah. And so it's when you starting there is like, it's like, okay, if they're the problem and I'm not the problem, which we need to talk about that, then what does that mean then for me to choose that identity of I am married? How do I operate knowing that this person is if they would just do this and do that.
Yeah.
And I adopt the identity of I am married. Now what? How do I work with that? The two.
Yeah. So I think this is where another useful metaphor comes into play. And it's a very simple one. I think that if we view marriage, and we'll just say for all practical purposes, as a TP, for example.
Yeah.
One person here, and they are leaning on each other and expecting to achieve growth. They're constantly going to run into each other. And if one goes away, then the other falls. Right. I would suggest, instead of viewing it as a structure, that a more practical view, a more helpful view, is to say that, okay, no, this is an environment. Both of us are trees, independently providing nutrients to a place that we desire to experience together. If one tree goes away, that other tree is still there. It has roots. It is still independent. It is still autonomous. But the environment has shifted. Right?
Right. Yeah.
It is no longer the same environment. However, right, it is still very much, with two trees that are planted in this place, it is still very much an environment they are both a part of, intrinsically. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Because at the end of the day, marriage takes two. And as much as it might seem like your partner is really riling you up and not doing this and not doing that, and if they would just do this and they would just do that, fair, right? Maybe there is a part that they definitely need to play. Maybe there is responsibility that they definitely need to take. Fair. And, right? And
That's a big and.
it's a big and there are three choices that you have in a marriage in response to conflict, communication, right? Issues. You can either, and I got this from Matthias Barker, another LPC, great guy.
Nice.
You can either confront, right? And like address, like we need to, confront the issue. You can either compromise and accept it for what it is, right? Because I feel like a lot of people compromise, but they don't compromise.
No.
Right?
It's like, okay, whatever, but they're still resentful.
Yeah. That means you haven't compromised.
Yeah, that's not compromise.
Yeah. Right? And that happens a lot.
That's resentment.
Yes, it's resentment. Or you can cut off, step away. Confront, compromise, or cut off, right? You have the choice of what you want to do there, right? You have the choice, and it feels unfair often because it's like, but they're the ones who they're the ones ruining this marriage. But like you said, you are married. Doesn't just because they may be having issues that are affecting the marriage, you are also married. And so what are you going to do as a married person? Right? So, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting way of looking at it.
I think that you bring up a really important point as far as the choices that we have. I think that many times when I see couples or even people that are, say, contemplating marriage or have been out of a marriage and want to get back into a marriage or something like that, right? A big thing that has to be discussed and reviewed, I think, for people in general, is to understand the level of ownership that they have in every relationship that they have.
Yeah.
Right? And how they play a part in the environment that they created.
Yes.
Right.
This is a very hard to do.
Oh.
Yeah.
To know that I am also responsible for the way that I either allow someone to treat me or the behaviors that I allow to continue in an environment that I have is a very difficult thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to accept. I may say, oh yeah, no, I realize this, but no, perhaps I hold myself in contempt for that. But if I really know, well, shoot, like I'm playing into this just as much, right?
Yeah.
I am a co-conspirator of this scenario. And I would say that's where people oftentimes get mistaken, right?
Yeah, and I think oftentimes it's because it's hard to see the duality of both. Because so one of the common dynamics I see is one partner will criticize their partner for not doing something that they expect. So like, hey, you're not connecting with me you're not listening. Every time I talk to you, you don't listen. You're not doing this. You're not doing that, right? And the criticism will actually provide a feedback loop where it actually leads to them not doing the thing that they want them to do. It's like, because you criticize me, why would I open up to you? I feel like I need to put my defenses up. I need to withdraw because all I get is criticism, right?
Yes.
So it's like, hey, let's work on the criticism piece. Notwithstanding, they might need to work on their defensiveness and take ownership of how they need to learn to be a lot better listener. But your criticizing is not going to help. And your criticizing might have actually made the situation worse. And that is hard to accept. And I've seen it in working with couples. It's hard to accept because it sounds like what you're telling me is I created this situation and I'm fully responsible for the situation, which is not what we're saying. You just said co-conspirators.
Exactly.
Co-conspirators, right? But that's it's so hard in the moment because of the pain that maybe one feels. Like, how can I be responsible, a co-conspirator of this pain? And I think there's a fear that if I own it, I will adopt an identity. And it goes back to our episode on like the judge and the advocate, that I will like judge myself so harshly, right? As much as I'm judging my spouse, and I won't be able to handle that.
Well, I think that brings up another really good point, because I think oftentimes that's part of the problem, is that there is a high level of judgment on self, right, for one partner. And they don't know how to handle that. Yeah. So then it is manifested outwardly. Right? Or rather, exactly. Or rather, there is a high level of insecurity within particular areas. Now, I will say I think that it's really important to understand, you were mentioning, okay, like one person perhaps being able to accept the notion that, yeah, I co-created this environment, even though they're like, how are we saying that? But I think oftentimes we don't realize what we went into without some form of conversation, without some form of agreeance inadvertently. Because in reality, we did agree. We just did it non-verbally. By participating, we agreed.
Yes.
By being, we agreed.
Yes.
Right. And I think this is a very important thing to understand. It's kind of like, perhaps we could say if you get into a relationship, say a woman gets into a relationship with a guy who he's just emotionally unavailable, and they're dating, and while they're dating, right, he's perhaps emotionally unavailable, yada, yada, yada. They get married and she wishes things would change, but nothing does. And perhaps she has a conversation about, hey, like, I wish you would connect with me more. We're married now. Why would that change now?
Why would it change? Based on
what exactly?
Yeah. There's that famous saying that women marry a man expecting that he would change, and men marry a woman expecting that she would never change.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, and it's like, but yeah, I mean, probably goes both ways at some point. But it's like, yeah, like why would they change?
Yes. And so I think that's a very important thing for us to be able to determine and look at, because yes, changes can occur. I fully believe, like, because I am so heavily leaning towards existentialism in general, like I believe, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, change is always
Like,
possible.
you can create change, absolutely. But you must accept that it is a battlefield. And
It
all
is a
around you,
battlefield.
yes, all around you, there are things that are going to try to assuage your ability to do so.
Yeah. Relationships without intentional action always lead to entropy,
Ooh, say that again.
right? So like relationships that have no intentional action always lead to entropy. They'll always lead to disorder, and I think it reiterates that idea of the battlefield. Like if there's no active, intentional work on a relationship, similar to how you would tend a garden, there'll be weeds, there'll be critters, and just it'll look like a mess, right? Because it needs intentional action. It needs habits to cultivate, which oftentimes at the beginning of a relationship, you're running on the engine of chemistry to keep that intention. It's like, man, dude, I could, staying up late, texting. I remember when my wife and I were dating. Dude, you could stay up for hours talking
You're
on the phone
until like 1
and
a.m.
and at this time I have assignments due the next day. I have homework. I have a job at school, but it's like no problem. Like, dude, I can go on. We can just keep talking, right? We were long distance too, so it was like, oh, it's okay. She's worth the distance, whatever. But that the engine of chemistry dies down, and that's when one of my friends, I think his best man told him this when he got married on his wedding day, that when the fires of passion die, let the embers of commitment respark that fire. Right? It's like we got to now change gears.
Yeah.
And that commitment is not based on a feeling. It's based on decision, on intention, on principle. Like I am gonna put effort into ensuring this thing grows and maintains health. Otherwise it'll descend. There's no just like stable, which I think is often the assumption we make, is like if we just autopilot, things will stay the same. Things will kind of be cool as they are. Like, why all of a sudden is you're not listening to me? You're not, all of a sudden. It's not usually all of a sudden. It's the small, little, accrued behaviors, habits, what the Gottmans would call bids for connection.
And remind us, who are the Gottmans?
Yeah, so John and Julie Gottman, relationship experts, did over 40 years of research on what makes couples work. They were able to predict, I think it was within 96 to 99%.
Incredible.
Within the first
incredible
3 minutes, whether a couple will divorce based on how they communicate. And so they're solid, very solid science. And they have this term called bids for connection. And it can be as small as like, how does your wife respond to you when you ask her how her day was? Right? Like small things like that. And do you turn towards each other or do you turn away from each other? That's the key. And those over time can create dynamics of your relationship where you're continually either turning towards each other or turning away from each other. And that can then all of a sudden you're like, how did we end up in this place?
Yeah. And
like, we're so far, we're so disconnected.
It sounds like it's really important to point out too, John and Julie, like it wasn't that they were able to predict a marriage simply based on some psychic reading. It was the fact that they were able to look at habits, behavior, and patterns that existed. And when those things existed, this is what we see, right? And if they're not interrupted, this is what we see. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So it's interesting because I think, on this conversation of, okay, like, yeah, love is a battlefield, or rather, marriage is a battlefield, love is a battlefield, right? I think it brings up an interesting point to what happens and what was it that happened for many people when their relationships don't work, when their marriages don't work. Was it the fact that they tried everything they could do? And this is perhaps maybe this means like a part 2 to this.
Maybe. Yeah.
To this podcast. Okay. But I think many times what I see is that there's one individual, perhaps, that, and we could argue that both didn't to a degree, that there is a lacking in one's ability to understand what they're capable of. And we may have touched on this in previous episodes. I can't remember actually. But I think it's very important to understand that if I am fully aware of myself, right? And that could arguably be a growing process. But I'm aware that I'm capable of bad things and I'm capable of good things. I can make bad decisions and I can make good ones. So I'm going to try my best to make good decisions towards that end. Paradoxically, I need to be aware that my spouse is capable of good decisions and bad ones. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we get this idea of people that, why, they would never do that to me. Or I would never do that to them. Yeah. I would never cheat on my wife.
Right. And when you do, you're like, how
did this happen?
How could I make such a terrible decision?
Exactly. How could I make such a terrible decision? Right? Which inherently is not only acting on the basis of some degree of pride, but also acting on the basis of not understanding humans' capabilities. So
what's the danger in that?
Well, the danger in that is we end up broken, alone, and desolate.
Yeah.
Right. I would suggest that. So full disclosure, I'll be the first to say I am capable of being unfaithful to my spouse. That could happen. Yeah. Right. But I make every effort, or I try extremely hard to be intentional and follow values that are in alignment with commitment and fidelity. Right. But I understand that capability exists, right? I am not above that, right? It's really important for me to know that of myself. Because if I think, oh yeah, no, then my guard comes down. Yeah. Then all of a sudden I find my place in some place that I never thought I would be. Right. Talking to people I never thought I would talk to. But if I'm aware that, oh no, like, I'm human. This could happen. That's a very different thing then, because now I can make intentional decisions to say, yeah, I'm not above that, which is why I need to work really hard to not do that. Which is why I need to foster, which is why I need to tend this garden. Yeah. Right? Paradoxically, with my spouse, if I'm aware, I love this woman, but I know she's human. I know that could happen. It doesn't mean I think less of her. It means I accept and I know that she's human. That could happen. So that if ever it did, I'm not broken to a pit of despair. I understand that the garden that I tended, rather, perhaps I didn't tend appropriately. Perhaps they didn't tend appropriately. Perhaps we leaned on each other so much that when one went, the other fell. Wow. So I think that's a really relevant point.
There's several.
Sorry, there's a lot there.
I want to go from.
Yeah, okay,
what you just said.
Yeah, so where are you going?
But yeah, I definitely see that. of like I would never do this, or I will always be this type of person. And you see that more so also, well, not more so, but it's more pronounced when couples are, they've reached a point where they have those like irreconcilable differences. Yeah. And again, the Gottmans would refer to this as like negative sentiment override, where you see your spouse as a certain way and you're like, they've done so much negative to you that you can't imagine the potential for them to do good.
That's powerful. Say that again.
Right? Like you see so much negative in your spouse because of maybe behaviors and also maybe thoughts you've continued to like nurture about their behavior, that you cannot see the potential of making positive, healthy choices. And that in and of itself needs to be worked on. Because if you can't even see the possibility or have hope that your spouse has potential for good and for change, then why are we here trying to improve our marriage or to resolve, right? It starts with believing that they can be better, right? Now the complete opposite of that is like the Michelangelo effect. Have you heard of that?
No, inform us.
Yeah. So it's this idea in many successful couples where you see your spouse maybe making bread, like my wife's into making bread right now.
Oh, it's delicious, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
it
good.
is. I agree. And I see that and I'm like, babe, you're like the next greatest baker in the history
British
of the world.
baking show.
Yeah, I love that show, by the way. I'm like, you're a star baker, right? And so you not only praise the good in them, but you're just like, dude, you're like, this is awesome. Like you're the best, right? In the sense that you just continue to see and not praise, but encourage their potential for good things, their potential to continue to be their best in the areas that they're excelling in. And you're like trying to build them up, right? Versus now the opposite way of like, dude, you're just always doing this. You never. And this person is this one way. And they just, even the positive things, there's a negative spin to them. Like, oh, you just did that because you just wanted our child to like you. You didn't do it because you care for them, right? So even the good things you see them do, you put a negative spin on them, and that's what we call negative sentiment override. And so I think what you're referring to is like capabilities for good and for evil, like trying to maintain that balance for yourself and also for your spouse. Like, yeah, they can, my spouse can do evil things. And with that too is, I think a lot of people are afraid of thinking that their spouse is capable of cheating on them.
100%.
Like, why would I marry someone if I know they can do that,
100%.
that they can make that choice?
Which is such an interesting paradox, because I think oftentimes people will get together with others, whether they're dating them or marrying them, that they never actually address core issues, but yet they're scared of them at the same time. They're scared of believing that they would be true. Right?
Yeah, like what if it's... yeah.
Exactly. So you mentioned, someone bringing up, you always do this. Chances are those behaviors were there when you were dating or when you initially got together. Mm-hmm. So why was it then that we didn't perhaps look at that and say, you know what, I don't know that this is something that I desire to cultivate with. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Why is that? Right? It's a legitimate question, right? Because yes, changes can happen. Absolutely. But to a certain degree, the level to which that change occurs and how quickly, especially if we didn't bring it up, especially if it was never something that was addressed, especially if we say, I don't like that you do this, but you know, whatever, we're just not going to talk about it and then go on.
Mm-hmm. What? Yeah. Assume things will get better.
We set ourselves up.
Yeah. It's the whole thing about assumptions, right?
Right.
Assumption will make an ass out of you and me.
Yes. Yes.
It's so true.
You know,
Uncommunicated expectation is predetermined resentment,
say that again.
right? Uncommunicated expectation is predetermined resentment. It's like you're setting yourself up for failure.
Absolutely.
Because we're not mind readers. And romanticism has convinced us that if we truly love each other, we should intuit. We should know beforehand what our spouse wants and needs. Otherwise, do they really love you? Do they really care for you? If they just don't know, they should already know it. Would it not be wonderful if they just knew what you needed?
That's so funny.
Knew what you loved, knew what you liked.
It's so funny. I think unintentionally we desire mothers, not partners.
Ooh.
Right? Because what you're describing there is a caretaker.
Yeah.
Not a partner. But I think many people desire that. They want someone who will dote on them, who will take care of them, who will be at their beck and call. And I would argue it's not even a mother, it's a maid.
It's a maid.
Right? Yeah. If you can afford that, go for it. Right?
Yeah.
But that's not a marriage.
It's not marriage.
Right? I think another really relevant point to this conversation is that perhaps even hearkening on the note of, well, what happens in problem marriages, right? Or what happens in failed relationships. I think that we don't understand appropriately what love is.
We don't understand what love is.
No.
Uh-huh.
Or we make an expectation and have this idea about love that it does these things and it doesn't do those things. Now, depending on what those are, yeah, perhaps could lead it. But I would say more often we say, okay, love is warm, fuzzy feelings that always last. They don't shift and fluctuate. They feel good all the time.
It's natural.
They don't confront. They don't condemn, right? Like we might have some of those good pieces there.
It's kind of smooth flowing. It's
comes easy.
If you force it, don't force it. It shouldn't be forced. Yeah. In the sense that you
needs to
shouldn't
come
have
natural,
to put work.
organically.
You don't have to put work into
yes.
it.
Yeah. And I would say that's crap. It's a load of crap.
You basically what you're saying is all the Disney movies.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what forget all those stories.
No, yeah. I think there's a reason they're called fairy tales. Right? Now, granted, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying
we love the fantasy.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there's a problem with fantasy. But I think even with fantasy, there needs to be a dose of reality.
Yeah.
To be able to measure. So perhaps an example of this would be to say that, like, if we believe that love, say, never confronts or doesn't try to hold a standard to, then I would say that we're also mistaken, because one of the ways that I know my wife loves me, right, is because she has a standard for me that she may not have for everyone else.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I used to resent that. I was like,
oh,
why do you ask this of me?
100%.
What's the problem here? You don't ask this of anyone else.
Right. Yeah, it's like, dude, this is unfair.
Right.
Why do I have such high expectation on me?
Right. Now, granted, hey, I think there can be a measurement there, right? It can absolutely go overboard.
Yeah.
Right. But I think a key difference, right, is, and her response to me was, because I know that you are capable of this, and because I care so deeply about you. Right? I know. And so it's like,
what do I do with that?
Right? But it's true. And I would say, similarly, I hold that same thing for her. Right? And so, yes, the way that I measure, right, the standard that's held, right? We could even look at this in terms, I was having a conversation with a dear friend, and we were on the topic of love, and they asked me, well, do I think love gives ultimatums?
Interesting.
I do.
Okay. Yeah.
I do think love could give an
Yeah.
ultimatum.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious where that question came from. Or like, what's the?
Well,
Is
so
it, like,
I think that
that love doesn't give.
yeah.
Like, what's the alternative?
So the alternative is that love doesn't give an ultimatum, because to give an ultimatum would be not loving, essentially. Very basic.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
A very basic idea to say, well, I wouldn't put you in the position to try to say, well, you or me. To some degree, we could say, oh, well, that might be an example of volatility, right? We don't want to be in relationships where people say, well, it's either my friends or your friends, or me or them, right? And so we could say, okay, love doesn't do that. But I
Yeah.
think that it's a very, like, to a degree, it's a very subjective question.
You're right.
Right?
It is. Yeah. What's an ultimatum? What is
Exactly.
it? How do we define an
If
ultimatum?
we're saying that, hey, love doesn't force you to make a decision that is inherently going to hurt you, or rather force you to choose between two healthy things, okay, I could get on board with that, right? If it's only on the premise of the other's jealousy, right? Because typically
Right.
that's what we connect it with,
Yeah.
right? In friendships, it's like you could hear like a middle school saying, well, it's either me or them,
Yeah.
right? But that's, one, you're not married. Two, those relationships could be equally beneficial.
Yeah.
And if I'm a friend, I'm not going to ask you to choose between two healthy things that are good for you, right? However, if I'm aware that there's one thing that's really not benefiting you, and I'm married, and I know that I would be remiss if I did not say, hey, look, I cannot continue to be present with this. This is not an environment I desire to be planted in. Please. That is an ultimatum,
That's an ultimatum. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And again, like with the ultimatum, it's like I noticed you said I can't continue because I have control over that.
Exactly. I do not desire to continue to be in this environment. And I don't know how to desire to be in this environment, because it's so contrary. Right? That's a very different type of ultimatum. Right? So I think it's relevant to note,
Yeah.
right? But coming back, I think more on love, I think the synopsis would be that
Yeah.
love challenges us. Love is hard. It's difficult. I would say that it is a choice,
It's a choice, 100%.
right? One that you make daily to pursue, that you strive again and again towards, that you lean in towards, because it makes you better.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I know, and I'm sure you've experienced the same thing with couples. It's like, well, what happens if I do all this work and they don't do anything? Well, hopefully you're a better person for it.
Right.
It's not wasted,
Yeah. Love. Yeah.
right?
Oof. Oof.
Love is
Yeah.
not wasted
Yeah.
ever.
Yeah, I think that's the C.S. Lewis quote. Like, love is not based on reciprocity. Like, the value of love, just because it's not reciprocated, it doesn't make your loving action less valuable.
Exactly. It's interesting because, okay, so I have to bring this up. I'm sorry.
Okay,
Like,
what are we reading?
So I just happened to have this book, right?
I just landed on
Right,
your-
just landed on my table.
Yeah.
But it's Soren Kierkegaard, Works of Love. And so obviously the reason I'm bringing this up is because many may hear this and be like, well, that's why I'm not getting married.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, you might hear a lot of what we talked about today and be like, dude, that sounds like a lot.
That's intense.
That's a lot. Battlefield, dude?
Yeah. Unappealing. And you would be
No
fair
thanks.
to think that.
Yeah.
It would be fair to think that. However, I think that it's also relevant to note that, and this is a personal belief, love is one of the most richest experiences that you can ever hope to strive for.
Wow.
Right. And I think
Agreed.
he sums this up, right? Because he mentions that, and the leading up to this, he talks about there's two types of deceptions we can make, right? He says, indeed, one can be deceived in many ways. One can be deceived in believing what is untrue. But on the other hand, one is also deceived in not only believing what is true, one can be deceived by appearances. One can also be deceived by the superficiality of shrewdness, by the flattering of conceit, which is absolutely certain that it cannot be deceived. Now that's really dense. So here's what Kierkegaard says about deciding not to try to engage with love. To cheat oneself out of love is the most terrible deception. It's an eternal loss for which there is no reparation, either in time or eternity. For usually, whatever variations there may be, when there is talk about being deceived in love, the one deceived is still related to love. And the deception is simply that it is not present where it was thought to be. But one who is self-deceived has locked himself out and continues to lock himself out of love.
Self-deceived in the sense that the experience not to love is hard, just as the experience to love is hard.
Yes.
So one has to choose their hard. By not choosing love, you're not escaping the difficulty.
100%.
That's what.
No, I
feel
think
like that's
I
what
think
he's
that's a
trying to get at.
great. I think that's a great way to sum up what he's saying here. Choose your difficulty.
Yeah.
It's interesting too because later on,
Mm-hmm.
you know, he talks about how deep this process goes,
Yeah.
and essentially, he again, I would say, reiterates the notion that love is a value. Right? He says the hidden life of love is in the most inward depths, unfathomable, and still has an unfathomable relationship with the whole of existence.
Yeah. It's a
Right.
value.
It's something that can't be searchable,
Yeah.
unfathomable,
Yeah.
something that you constantly pursue but you never reach the end of.
I like to think of it as we often think of love like a fire that spontaneously sparks.
Sure.
But love is more like the ocean. Like it's quiet. It's like the waves. But it's ever present. It's ever constant. It's deep. It's vast, and it's a value essentially.
Yeah. And one, again, brought this up because it's one that's necessary for marriage, for any relationship.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a thing that all of a sudden appears. Right? It's not warm and fuzzy feelings. It's something that you pursue that in and of itself is so valuable that you can't even reach the end of it.
Yeah.
And I would say that misconception
Yeah.
is a huge reason that there is both challenges in marriages and relationships, but then also why they may fail.
For sure. Yeah. I heard at a wedding, a homily was shared, and I think it was the pastor. He said, he asked this question to the audience. He's like, how can you love unconditionally if the person meets all your conditions? Right? And that was like, interesting.
Yeah.
How can you love unconditionally? You know, like, and it's that idea that, of course, like, we can talk about how to choose a partner, right? Before marriage. That could be its whole episode, because there are some conditions beforehand, when you like your values and areas
Sure.
of compatibility.
Sure.
But then when you choose to be married, when you choose to commit, right?
When you choose to allow it to be something that you are and not something
Yeah,
that you have.
right. That's what we're talking about. That's that value. That goes deeper than mere circumstance or mere like, oh, if they're not doing this, then I'm not doing it,
Mm.
kind of thing. Like, I'm not gonna be as loving if they're not, right? And again, love looks differently in many ways. Love can look like confrontation. Love
Yeah.
can look like, passionate intimacy. Love is vast in how it manifests as a value and a principle. I got a quote for you, Dale.
Okay.
As we close up here.
Okay.
It's from The Mystery of Marriage
Mm.
by Mike Mason.
I haven't read it. Tell me.
Oh, dude,
Show me.
It's so good. It's so good. So, he. This is one of my favorite quotes on marriage, and he says, "It is no small thing to open up our hearts and our arms and allow another to enter there, to grant to another person the same worth, the same consequence, the same existential gravity that we take for granted in ourselves." Right? The fact is, our natural tendency is to treat people as if they were not others at all, but merely aspects of ourselves. We do not experience them as the overwhelming comprehensive realities that we feel ourselves to be. Compared with us, they are not quite real. We see them as if through a haze, the haze of our own all-engulfing selfhood. We're constantly filtering others through the fine electrical mesh of our own private system of perception, so that what finally reaches our awareness and registers there is not usually a real person at all, but a sort of computer image, a reconstruction based on our own personal programming and biases. We live in a heavily screened, body-guarded reality. Not much gets through the barbed wire, and not much gets by the great bulldog of the ego. For truly to open up our hearts to other people is to invite them into our own throne room and to sit them down on our very own throne, on the seat normally warmed by no one but ourselves. And to do that is to have the throne, the seat of the ego, rocked right off its foundations. And then this is like the last thing he says. Love is an earthquake that relocates the center of the universe. Dang. That quote always gets me. Love is an earthquake that relocates the center of the universe.
Yes. Which is interesting because what he talked about there, it almost sounds like he's making a suggestion that it teaches us that we are not the center of our own universe. Right.
And that we don't actually want to be. And I think
No.
that's what Kierkegaard is getting at.
Yes.
It's like, you don't want to be the center of your universe.
No, and I think it's important to reiterate that I think this is what happens, I think, most often when things don't work, when they do fail, is that those ways of being and those thoughts were not admonished. They were not accepted. They were rejected. Either by decision or omission from a decision. Right? So, lots of stuff.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff.
Marriage.
Yes.
Isn't it great?
Yeah. It's fantastic and fantastically beautifully hard. So,
Yeah.
again,
Yeah, to another 10 years of marriage for me.
Yeah,
to get
right?
to your 15.
right, and we may have to revisit parts of this, but I think we did a good job summing up the first.
Yeah, the first reflections.
Yeah, first reflections.
Yeah, love is a battlefield.
Yeah. Why marriage?
Hey, it's great, guys. Come through.
Exactly.
Come through.
Yeah.
All right.
Till next time.